Here, let's do 2019. I think this is set 2. Set 2. 2019, number 2, it's an indirect tax question. Hats are produced in a perfectly competitive industry, and the government imposes a per unit sales tax on hats. Using the labeling from the graph, identify each of the following. Now, these are done almost the same way every time. This one's a little bit different, but some of the same characteristics. We know when a tax is imposed, supply shifts to the left, S plus tax. We have a new price that the buyer pays, P3. We have a new price that the seller would put in his pocket. So this is the price the buyer would now pay. This is the money or the price that the seller would put in his pocket or receive, is P1. And that should be an understanding there, is the vertical distance between these two curves, anywhere on these two curves, the vertical distance is the amount of tax. So the difference between P3 and P1 right now is the amount of the tax. So the after-tax price paid by the consumer would be P3. The area that represents the revenue received by the government is what we call the tax wedge. So it should be recognized as all of that, all of this shaded in area would be considered the tax wedge. And that should make sense, right? If the vertical distance here is the amount of tax, we could say P3 minus P1 is the tax. We just have to multiply that by the quantity of Q2, and that would give us the tax revenue that the government would put in their pocket. And that should make sense. All right. They're not asking us to find that. They just want the area, so we would say what? P1, P3, SZ. I think that's right. P1, P3, SZ. Now assume instead that the demand for hats is perfectly inelastic. So let's back up here. This is where it gets a little bit more challenging. And let's recognize that if suddenly the demand was perfectly inelastic, it would look like that. It'd be straight up and down demand curve. Now assume instead the demand is for hats is perfectly inelastic. At Q3, will the supply and per unit tax remain while the supply and the per unit tax remains unchanged? Will the after-tax price paid by consumers be higher, lower, or the same compared to the price in your answer to part A1? Recognize that with a perfectly inelastic demand, let's do it over here first. With a perfectly straight up and down demand curve, when supply decreases due to that tax, the price goes up, but the quantity the consumer buys doesn't change. If your demand is perfectly inelastic, it means no matter what happens to the price, you will still buy the same quantity down here on the bottom. That being said, when demand is perfectly inelastic, the producer can push all of the tax onto the consumer. So that producer can push or make the consumer pay all of the tax. The consumer can pay all of that tax because their demand is perfectly inelastic. Did I say that right? The consumer would pay all of the tax because their demand is perfectly inelastic. So the new price would be P4. It would be higher. Will the total tax revenue received by the government be higher, lower, or the same compared to the tax revenue in your answer to part A1? So before, the price was P3 and the quantity was Q2. Now the price is P4 and the quantity is Q3. We can see there's more quantity here, right? The vertical distance between these two curves hasn't changed. Instead of being here and there as a vertical distance, now we're here and here. That hasn't changed. But the quantity sold has changed. So we would explain that as demand is perfectly inelastic, price increased, quantity increased, tax revenue for the government increased and went up. And you'd write that out a little bit better. Don't use arrows. All right, and I think we could just say since there's a larger quantity, that quantity is now Q3, we know tax revenue had to increase. All right. This is the one that's a bit strange to say. If the demand for hats remains perfectly inelastic and the per unit sales tax is reduced, will producer surplus increase, decrease, or stay the same? So let me see if I can take a shot at this one. It's a bit, because we need to show some things moving here. All right. So right now, what we can know by looking at this is that all of this area right here is the amount of tax that's being paid by the consumer. So we really can understand that this down here is producer surplus, right? Let's recognize that's producer surplus. That all of this area is what we would consider the consumer is paying all of the tax. So, and the tax was pretty much put in place because of the government imposing the tax, shifting the supply here. In essence, the consumer pays all of it. So now let's play the game and say that maybe the government didn't want to tax it quite as much as they did. And let's say they only taxed it half as much. Let's see if we can move. Can I move that? Let's say they only taxed it that much. Now, if they only taxed it half as much, can we recognize, sorry guys, can we recognize that that would have been the new price? And all of this would have been the part the consumer paid of the tax? Producer surplus would not have changed at all, right? Because the consumer's paying all of that area. As that supply curve, or as that tax decreases, the supply curve would shift. I want to do that. I'm going to shift it like this again. Let's say they only taxed it a quarter of what they thought they were going to do. Again, recognize that the consumer only pays that amount of the tax. Producer surplus still hasn't changed, right? We could see that now that even with that little bit of tax right there, consumers would have still paid all of it. Producers' surplus would not have changed at all because the consumer is paying all of that tax. So let's see if I can explain that. If the demand for hats remains perfectly in, per unit sales tax is reduced. We saw it being reduced and reduced. And only thing that decreased was the amount of tax that the consumer pays. The price went down, obviously, but the amount of consumer tax would decrease. Will producer surplus increase or stay the same? We'd say it stay the same. Explaining it, as the tax is reduced, the portion paid by consumers decreases, the producer surplus would remain unchanged. Not looking at the answers, I would assume there's something like that. This one is 2019 Set 2. Look it up on the FRQ or the AP College website and make sure that I've got that last one. That's the only thing is the wordage that they use to explain that. I think they simply are probably going to say that as the tax is reduced, the price decreases, the amount that the consumer pays would decrease along with that decrease in price and tax due to the demand being perfectly inelastic. All right. Okay, I think we're good. Everybody be safe, take care. Bye. 2 more months till the AP exams.